After being humiliated, an elderly black veteran made one call: "I want every one of them fired." The cardboard box felt heavier than it should have. Inside were 19 years of a life folded into books, a small potted plant someone had given him for his birthday, and a single framed photograph, his late wife, smiling in a garden that no longer existed. Marcus Webb stood on the courthouse steps, holding that box against his chest like a shield, his phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tight enough to ache. Behind him, 3 uniformed officers stood with their arms crossed, watching him, the way men watch something they've already decided is dangerous. Not one of them had asked his name. Not one of them had asked why a 68-year-old man in a pressed Navy suit was being escorted out of a federal building like a criminal. They had simply acted fast, certain, and wrong. "Get him out of here," the younger one had said less than 10 minutes earlier. "Before this gets worse." Now Marcus stood on the sidewalk, humiliated in front of strangers, in front of colleagues he had worked beside for years, in front of the very building he had walked into every morning at 6:15 for almost 2 decades. He didn't shout, he didn't argue, he simply reached for his phone, dialed a number he rarely used, and waited. 2 rings, then a voice, calm and immediate. "Director Ross." Marcus closed his eyes for one long breath. "It's Webb," he said. "I need every name of every officer standing on those steps in the next hour. I want every one of them fired." There was a pause on the other end. The kind of pause that told Marcus the man on the phone understood exactly what those words meant, and exactly who was saying them. But 18 months earlier, a moment like this would have seemed impossible. Marcus Webb had been a soldier before he was anything else. He enlisted at 19, the same year his father died of a heart condition the family couldn't afford to treat properly. He served 2 tours overseas as a combat engineer, clearing roads that other men were too afraid to walk. He came home with a Purple Heart, a limp that worsened every winter, and a quiet, immovable belief that dignity was not something you asked for. It was something you carried, whether or not anyone else recognized it. For years after his service, Marcus worked with his hands. He was a maintenance supervisor, then a building operations manager, then, after going back to school at 42, studying at night while raising 2 children alone after his wife's first diagnosis. A certified federal facilities inspector. It took him longer than most. He wasn't given anything. He earned every promotion the hard way, filling out every form twice, showing up early, staying late, correcting every assumption people made about him with patience instead of anger. By the time he was 59, Marcus Webb had become one of the most respected federal safety and security inspectors in the region, a man whose signature on an inspection report meant something. Judges knew him by name. Marshals greeted him with a handshake. He had walked those same courthouse steps 1,000 times in every kind of weather, carrying a clipboard instead of a gun, and no one had ever questioned whether he belonged there. Until the day everything changed, the day the building got a new, younger security contractor and, with it, an entirely new set of officers who had never met him. It started small, a missed introduction, a new supervisor who never bothered to circulate photos of senior staff, a rotation of young officers, freshly hired, trained more on suspicion than procedure, who had been told, vaguely and carelessly, to watch for anyone who looks out of place. Marcus noticed the first signs weeks before anything happened. A guard who used to wave him through now asked for his badge every single time, scanning it slower than necessary, holding it a few extra seconds too long. As if daring it to be fake, another officer began following 2 steps behind him on his rounds, arms crossed, silent, as though Marcus were a suspect being tailed rather than an inspector doing his job. He said nothing. He had learned, over a lifetime, that some fights were worth having quietly, through the proper channels, and some assumptions corrected themselves once people simply did their jobs long enough to see the truth. He filed no complaints. He simply kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept being exactly who he had always been. Patient, precise, professional. But patience has its limits. And injustice, when left unspoken, does not shrink. It grows roots. The morning it happened, Marcus arrived at 7:10, exactly as he had for 19 years. He was carrying his usual leather folder of inspection documents and a badge clipped neatly to his lapel. He walked through the side entrance reserved for staff, nodded to the young officer at the desk, a man named Daniel Pruitt, no older than 26, and continued toward the elevator. "Sir, stop right there." Marcus turned, expecting a routine badge check. Instead, he found 3 officers approaching him at once, hands resting near their belts, expressions hard and suspicious. "I need to see identification," Pruitt said. Marcus reached calmly for his badge, still clipped to his jacket, and held it up. "It's right here," he said evenly. "Marcus Webb, Federal Facilities Inspector. I've had this credential for 11 years. Pruitt barely glanced at it. "Barely. We got a report of an unauthorized individual matching your description, trying to access restricted areas." "I'm not trying to access anything restricted," Marcus said. "I'm doing my scheduled inspection of the East Wing. It's on the calendar. You can check with facilities management." "We'll check," another officer said, stepping closer. "After we secure the situation." "Secure the situation," Marcus repeated quietly, the words landing on him like something physical. He looked around. A handful of court staff had begun to gather near the lobby, drawn by the raised voices, watching the scene unfold with the particular stillness of people who sense something is wrong but aren't sure whether to intervene. "Sir, I need you to place the folder down and step away from the elevator." "This folder contains confidential inspection documents," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tightening in his chest. "I am not placing federal documents on the floor." That was the moment it escalated, not because Marcus had done anything, but because one young officer, nervous and overcorrecting for that nervousness, reached out and grabbed his arm. "Sir, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marcus stopped moving entirely, not because he was afraid, but because in that instant, decades of memory collapsed into a single point of clarity. Every job interview where his credentials were questioned twice as hard as anyone else's. Every meeting where a younger, less experienced colleague was addressed before him. Every moment he had swallowed his pride so the room could stay comfortable. He had done everything right, every single time, for 19 years, in this exact building, and it had not been enough to be trusted at first glance. "Take your hand off me," he said, quiet and clear. The officer didn't. Instead, within another 30 seconds, Marcus Webb, decorated veteran federal inspector, a man with more service to that building than every officer standing around him combined, was being walked out through the front doors while confused colleagues watched. His badge still clipped uselessly to his jacket, his folder of confidential documents carried, almost mockingly, by the very people who had refused to believe he had any right to hold it. They didn't handcuff him. They didn't need to. The humiliation was complete without it. The stares, the whispers, the box someone brought down from his office for his safety, as though he were being fired rather than falsely detained. Someone had already begun packing his desk before anyone verified a single fact. That was when Marcus understood, not with anger, but with a terrible, settled clarity, that this was not a misunderstanding. This was what happens when systems are built on assumption instead of verification, when people are trained to see danger in a 68-year-old black man in a suit before they see 19 years of service standing in front of them. He stepped outside, box in hand, and made the call. What none of those officers knew, what no one on that new security contract had bothered to learn, was that Marcus Webb did not simply inspect that federal building. He had, 6 months earlier, been appointed Regional Director of Federal Courthouse Safety Compliance for the entire district, a position that gave him direct oversight authority over every security contract, every training protocol, and every personnel decision tied to that building's protection. The announcement had gone out in an internal memo that the new contractor's leadership had apparently never circulated to their own officers. The man on the other end of Marcus's call, Director Ross, wasn't just a colleague. He was Marcus's direct supervisor, and more importantly, the man who had fought hardest for Marcus's promotion, who had told him personally, "You've earned every bit of this, Webb. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." "Where are you right now?" Ross asked. "Standing outside the courthouse, holding a box of my own belongings," Marcus said. "They pulled me out of my building, Ross, in front of staff, in front of the public. Grabbed my arm. Never once checked my credentials properly." There was a long silence. "Give me 40 minutes, Ross said. "Don't go anywhere. And Marcus, I need you to know this is going to be handled exactly the way it should have been handled from the start." Marcus lowered the phone and looked up at the building he had served for nearly 2 decades. The 3 officers were still watching him from the steps, arms crossed, unaware that the call they had just watched him make would end their careers within the hour. What happened next unfolded with a speed that startled everyone who witnessed it. Within 20 minutes, a black government vehicle pulled up to the curb. Director Ross stepped out, flanked by 2 members of the Office of Professional Responsibility. He didn't approach Marcus first. He walked directly to the 3 officers still standing on the steps. "Badge numbers," Ross said. "All 3 of you." Pruitt straightened. "Sir, we responded to a reported security concern." "You detained and removed a federal regional director from his own building without verifying his credentials," Ross said, his voice carrying across the plaza. "You physically restrained a decorated veteran with 19 years of federal service. You did this in front of court staff, in front of the public, and you did it without a single verification call to facilities, to his office, or to me. We didn't know who he was," one of the other officers said. "That," Ross said, "is exactly the problem." He turned and walked to Marcus, extending a hand, not for a handshake first, but simply resting it briefly on Marcus's shoulder, an old gesture between 2 men who had worked together long enough to not need words for everything. "I'm sorry," Ross said. "Sorry." Loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "This should never have happened, not to you, not to anyone." Marcus nodded once, still holding his box. "It shouldn't have happened to anyone," he agreed. "That's the part that needs fixing." By early afternoon, the story had already moved through the building like electricity. Word spread that the man dragged out that morning wasn't a trespasser at all, but the very official responsible for overseeing the security contract of the officers who removed him. Staff who had watched the incident in uncomfortable silence now watched Marcus walk back through the front doors, this time flanked by Director Ross and 2 representatives from the contracting company. Summoned within the hour, visibly rattled. The 3 officers were placed on immediate unpaid suspension, pending a full review. Within a week, an internal investigation confirmed what everyone already suspected. No verification protocol had been followed, no attempt had been made to check facility records, and the security report that triggered the incident had originated from a vague, unconfirmed comment made by a new employee who had simply never seen Marcus before and assumed, based on nothing but appearance, that he didn't belong. 2 of the 3 officers were terminated. The 3rd, Pruitt, the youngest, the one who had first stopped him, was given a choice: resignation or a formal disciplinary process that would follow him permanently. He resigned within the day. But Marcus, when Ross came to him afterward with the final report, didn't celebrate. He read it twice, slowly, then set it down on his desk. "I don't want this to just be about 3 men losing their jobs," he said. "That doesn't fix anything. It just moves the same problem to someone else's building next year." What Marcus did next was the part of the story that no headline could have captured properly. Though several tried, he didn't sue. He didn't hold a press conference filled with outrage. Instead, he requested, and was granted, full authority to redesign the security onboarding and training protocol for every federal courthouse in the district. He personally sat down with the contracting company's leadership and laid out, point by point, exactly what had gone wrong. No photo circulation of senior officials, no verification escalation procedure, no training on implicit bias, no accountability structure that required officers to check facts before acting on assumption. He didn't do it with anger. He did it the way he had done everything for 40 years, methodically, thoroughly, without raising his voice, because he understood something that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Real change doesn't come from humiliating people the way he had been humiliated. It comes from making sure the system itself no longer allows that humiliation to happen to the next person walking through those doors. 3 months later, every officer working federal courthouse security in the district went through a new 16-hour training program built around a single case study, Marcus's own case, presented not with his name attached for shame, but as an example of what happens when procedure gives way to assumption. New officers were shown photographs of senior staff on day 1. A mandatory verification call was now required before anyone could be physically removed from a federal building. And for the first time, officers were trained specifically on recognizing and interrupting their own unconscious bias before it became action. Marcus attended the first training session himself. He stood at the front of the room in the same navy suit he had worn the day he was dragged out of his own building and told the room exactly what had happened to him. Calmly, without bitterness, but without softening a single detail. "I want you to understand something," he told the new recruits. "I am not here because I want revenge. I had that chance, and I chose something different because revenge fixes nothing for the next person who walks through these doors and doesn't look like what you expect a person of authority to look like. What I want is simple. I want you to check every time. Before you act, before you assume, before you decide someone doesn't belong somewhere, check. That single habit is the difference between doing your job and doing harm." The room was silent. Several officers, including some who would never have to live through what Marcus had lived through, later admitted the story had changed the way they approached every single shift that followed. 6 months after the incident, Director Ross asked Marcus if he wanted to press forward with a formal recognition ceremony, an apology on record, a public acknowledgement from the courthouse administration. Marcus declined the ceremony, but accepted something smaller and, to him, more meaningful. A simple plaque near the staff entrance, listing the verification protocol now required before anyone could be removed from the building, alongside a short statement about the importance of dignity and due process for every person who walks through those doors, regardless of appearance. He didn't put his name on it. He didn't need to. Everyone who worked in that building knew exactly why it was there. Marcus still comes in most mornings at 7:10, box no longer in hand, badge no longer questioned. The younger officers who now staff the courthouse know his name before they ever see his face, because his story is part of their training now. Not as a cautionary tale about punishment, but as a lesson about what it costs an institution when it fails to see a person clearly. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, a new recruit will approach him in the hallway, hesitant, and ask if he's really the man from the training video. Marcus always answers the same way. "I am," he says, "and I'm still here. Still doing the job. Still checking every door myself, because that's what 19 years taught me. You don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it by doing the work long enough that no one has an excuse left to doubt you." He pauses, almost every time, before adding one more thing. "But you shouldn't have to earn it twice. Just because of how you look walking through a door. That's the part we're still fixing. And we will. There was one more conversation that mattered more to Marcus than any of the official proceedings that followed, a conversation almost no one else witnessed. 2 weeks after the incident, a knock came at his office door. It was Daniel Pruitt, the young officer who had grabbed his arm, who had resigned rather than face the disciplinary process. He stood in the doorway in street clothes, no longer in uniform, looking smaller somehow than he had on those courthouse steps. "I'm not here to ask for my job back," Pruitt said quickly. Before Marcus could respond, "I just needed to say it to your face. I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry you say because you got caught. The kind I've been sitting with every night since." Marcus studied him for a long moment. He could have said nothing. He had every right to let the young man carry that silence out the door with him. Instead, he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down," Marcus said. Pruitt sat, visibly bracing for something harder than what came. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Marcus said. "It isn't. What happened to me that morning was not a small thing, and I won't shrink it to make you comfortable. But I've lived long enough to know the difference between a man who does wrong and doesn't care, and a man who does wrong and can't stop thinking about it. You're sitting in my office instead of avoiding this building for the rest of your life. That tells me something." "I don't know how to fix it," Pruitt admitted. "You don't fix it," Marcus said. "You carry it forward differently. Every job you take after this, every person you meet who doesn't look like what you expected, you check first. You ask first. You remember this room, and you remember exactly how it felt to sit in that chair." He paused. "That's not forgiveness. That's just the truth of what happens next, if you let it change you instead of just embarrassing you." Pruitt left that day without a promise of reinstatement, without an easy resolution, but with something Marcus considered more valuable. A young man who understood finally the actual weight of what assumption can cost another human being. Marcus Webb never asked to become a symbol. He asked that morning on the courthouse steps for one thing only: accountability. What he built afterward was something far larger than the apology he was owed. He built a system designed to make sure the next person carrying a box out of that building did so by choice, not by assumption, not by suspicion, not by the quiet, corrosive belief that some people simply don't look like they belong in the rooms they've spent a lifetime earning the right to stand in. If this story moved you, share it. Stories like Marcus Webb's rarely make headlines, but they happen every single day, in buildings just like this one, to people who have already given more than enough to be trusted at first glance. They deserve to be told.